Welcome to Second Saturday Conversation. Here on Second Saturdays, we explore Christianity in and for the 21st century. Christianity in the 21st century is changing. Christianity for the 21st century, that's part of our wonderment and curiosity. And we think that Christianity does have something to offer the 21st century. Our overall theme for this year is evolution of the word. All things change. And evolution of the word could be, some of us might associate word with Bible, or the word with Jesus, or word with God, or it could be word as we use language. But in our lifetime and over the generations, there has been an evolution of our understanding of word on all kinds of levels. All things change. We don't live in a static world. There may have been a time where we thought that there was an ideal, ultimate understanding, but that is no longer. We live in a field of excitability, and there are possibilities, and there's the possibility of novelty and surprise and change, and all of that is that in which we live and move and have our being. We use two quotes. We use them every time this year. One from Acts: God is that in which we live and move and have our being. So this just underscores our understanding that the reality and world that we live in is constantly changing, as are we. And the other quote that we use every time is from 1 Corinthians, and that is, we see through a glass darkly, or we see through a mirror dimly. Now we know only in part. So with that in mind, we realize that everything actually requires an interpretation, the great art of interpretation. And to interpret wisely and well, we need to be discerning. We need to use our hearts and minds, and have an openness and a humility and a curiosity, and I think humor is also essential. So with all of that in mind, that's how we gather together in that kind of spirit today. So welcome. And before I get underway and talk a little bit about the Christmas stories, Jeff Creswell, if you are nearby, why don't you say a little bit about the chat and the plenary session, which will come up in about a half an hour or so, and how best to make use of the chat and our time at plenary. Hi, Jeff.
Thanks, Marianne. Hi.
Yeah.
And hello, everybody, and welcome again to Second Saturday. We're really glad that you're here. As we have done in the past, the chat will be a place for you to be able to put your comments, your questions, your wonderings, and I will be monitoring the chat during Marianne's sharing with us. And when we come to the plenary, I'll be drawing from the chat and inviting people who've written in the chat to share their comment or their question or their wondering. And in addition to that, if you aren't comfortable putting something in the chat, or something arises as you hear Marianne's response to something, please feel free to move your cursor down to the bottom where it says reactions, and there's an option to raise your hand. And when that's done, your video will show up in the front of the queue, and I'll know that you have something you'd like to say, and I can call on people who have a hand raised as well. So
Great. Thanks, Jeff. This morning, I want to reflect a little bit on this season of Christmas. I'm going to start with a couple of memories of my own. I'll comment briefly on the birth narratives in Matthew and Luke. They're only in Matthew and Luke. And then talk a little bit about kind of what's bothering me this year. For some reason, moving into this Christmas season has it's been difficult for me, and I want to share with you what I've been wrestling with and get your thoughts in response to it. First of all, I want to acknowledge that this, for many of us, this is a difficult time of year. It is for me. I think it's a difficult time of year for many of us. You know, there's all of this, you know, festivity and Christmas decorations and, you know, sort of jolliness and lights and frivolity and gift giving. And I'm all for wanting us to have a time in our lives where we can just say, oh, it's like a seventh inning stretch. It's like, let's just enjoy this season and its vitality and all of that. And you know, I appreciate that. But I'm also very, very aware that the way that the culture celebrates Christmas, which really is about gift purchasing and gift giving, and I mean, it's an economic indicator. It has nothing to do with what the birth narratives are about, at least as I see it. Christmas in the culture has really nothing to do with what we call Christmas from the birth narratives in the New Testament. So for me, there's this real cognitive dissonance between, you know, well, what is Christmas about for us, for those of us who may call ourselves Christian, and what is this season in our culture? So I think there's a tension there. And I, for one, my Christmases growing up were difficult, and I'm just going to acknowledge a couple of things about that. My parents, my mother, when she was age 12, her father died on Christmas morning. Okay, so mother was 12. Her father, whom she adored, died on Christmas morning, and she claims that she never went back to the house. She also did not go to his funeral. There's a lot about what her life was like after her father died and how her family dealt with that. She never talked about it. But for her, Christmas morning is a reminder of, my gosh, my father died on Christmas morning unexpectedly. Okay, he went upstairs to take a little nap and never woke up. So my father, at age 4, lost his mother. His mother died. And he had a stepmother. And the only thing I know about his stepmother is, and this is harsh, okay, so I'm just giving you a warning. The only thing I knew about his stepmother, aside from the fact that he did not like her, is that she beat his dog to death in a burlap bag. Okay. So, and in my parents' life together and in starting their own family, I have an older brother. I think that their sense of family and what is family and what is it to celebrate and come together as a family was fractured very, very early on. And my recollection of Christmases, and I was born in Saudi Arabia, and I lived there until I was 8. So we had Christmas in Arabia, and we had the Christmas tree. And by the way, Santa came on Christmas morning. He flew in by helicopter and parked in the parking lot at the senior staff school. And he came out of the helicopter, and I never understood the Santa Claus thing. My parents, I wasn't brought up with the Santa Claus story, so I really didn't understand that. But we did celebrate Christmas. We had our own Christmas tree and decorated. I'll say more about that in just a moment. But I think that the idea of gathering for Christmas was it was heavy laden with a tremendous amount of unnamed, it took me years to sort of figure this out, but unnamed and unspoken grief. And I think both of my parents had a tremendous amount of unresolved grief in their life. And the Christmas holiday time seemed to be one of those times when that heaviness of grief just filled the air. At the same time that there were Christmas trees and lights that were up in the neighborhood. We'd take a little drive and see the houses that had been, decorated with lights and all of that. But, and there was, as time went on, there was much too much drinking at Christmas, and the emotions that were expressed were all kind of odd and inappropriate. And it was kind of a confusing time. And we decorated the tree, but we always finished it, at least in Arabia, with angel hair. Do you remember that? I think it was spun glass. And so, the tree would look perfectly fine, but we'd cover it with this angel hair, which was almost like putting a veil over it. And it was just, I don't know, there was something about angel hair that instead of it looking luminous, it made everything even more murky. So my experience of Christmas was always, and as a child, I didn't quite understand it all. As I grew up, I recognized this deep undertow of grief, unresolved grief that seemed to visit us at every Christmas. And even though over my years, I've spent many Christmas in church and all of that, whenever I approach the season, what I always have to, or what I do confront first off, is this sense of grief and actually almost dread that accompanied Christmas. Okay. Now, that's my story, but I wanted to share it to just acknowledge that for many reasons, Christmas may be a difficult time for many of you. And of course, this year, post-COVID, and as we're getting older, there's less family members showing up. And so there's, I think it's a difficult time of year. And I think the juxtaposition between what we see sort of in the culture and maybe what we are dealing with in our own experience is difficult. And it may be hard to talk about it this time of year because we're actually supposed to be in this much more celebratory mode. I do want to share a really positive memory I have of Christmas. On Christmas Eve, we would all go down to the baseball field and sit in the bleachers. And every year there was a nativity scene. And and I knew enough about baseball, even though I was little, to know about first, second, third, home, So every year, and we would do this, we'd go to the baseball field, and Mary and Jesus, and baby Jesus and Joseph, and real camels and real goats and real sheep would come onto the field somewhere actually between first and second, but they'd come onto the field, and then they'd round the field and they would head towards home. And I remember seeing that scene year after year. And even though over the years, my idea of home has changed a lot, but even as a little kid, I had this sense of somehow coming home, sort of returning to ourselves in a way. And what else I remember really deeply from my childhood is, these were in Arabia, we were out in the desert. There wasn't the light pollution that we have today. And the sky was jet black, but the stars were just, you almost felt like you could touch them, but their radiance and twinkling was really magical. And on the few occasions where we have an electric storm, Okay, the sky would be penetrated with what now in retrospect kind of look like blood vessels, all lit up across the sky. And so there was something about that deep dark sky, and then this light that shone through the stars, but that also sort of expressed itself across this dark sky, and this limitless horizon, just this limitless horizon looking out into the deep, deep night. And this image of this family making a journey. And I got the sense very early on that it's a journey to home. So that's also part of my Christmas memory. And that is obviously, it stayed with me for my whole lifetime. And I return to it and think about it again and again. I'm also struck that Jack Caputo has talked about the impression of the deep night sky and stars, and so did Brian McLaren when he was with us last week. And Marcus had a fascination with the dark sky and the stars. And by the way, he almost had a comet named after him. He missed it by about 45 minutes. But Marcus used to enter into the dark night sky in wonder. Okay, and I have an experience of that dark night sky and wonder as well. So, so much for my experience of Christmas. But I just want to acknowledge that I know it can be a difficult time of year. So at Plenary, if some of you have some comments about how do you see Christmas, what is this like for you? I would welcome your thoughts about that. By the way, the gift giving thing, I'll just say one more thing about this. That was always very problematic. We probably also, spent too much money, and was there ever enough gratitude for it all? So this gift giving thing too. Instead of it being sort of generous and free, it had a kind of cost to it. So as I said, perhaps a difficult time of year for some. I want to say a little bit now about the birth narratives in Matthew and in Luke. Here, I'm going to throw my balls. The birth narratives are only in Matthew and Luke. Mark, which is our earliest gospel, doesn't say anything about the Jesus birth. Paul, who was our earliest, the earliest writings of the New Testament are from Paul, no mention of Jesus' birth. So as Marcus and Dom very thoughtfully help us reflect upon the birth narratives in their book, The First Christmas, and I highly, highly recommend that. It'll give you lots of information about the development of the birth stories and suggested meaning, okay, The First Christmas by Marcus and Dom. The birth narratives were a late development. And let me just remind us that we wouldn't have a need for birth narratives about Jesus if it weren't for the quality and the impact of his life and also of his death. So if it weren't for the crucifixion of Jesus and then what followed after his crucifixion, what arose in the communities and what people continued to experience that they had learned from Jesus, a different vision of how to live in the world and a different sense of possibility of how to be with one another. If it weren't for the power of that and for the power of people's experience of Jesus, there wouldn't be a need for the birth stories, okay? Matthew was written maybe in the late 80s, mid-late 80s. Some say that Luke might not have been written even until as late as 120, who knows? But these are late developments. Jesus was executed in about 30 CE. So decades later, these narratives are developed. And they are, in a sense, the language of the birth narratives are more mythological. Now, I don't want that to sound dismissive, Myths are efforts to talk about our origins. So knowing the impact that Jesus had had on the community, and even after his death, the early members of the Christian community wanted to talk about about his own origins that might contribute to and explain the meaning of the importance of his life. Okay, so these are stories, and I don't say that in a dismissive way either. These are stories and ways to try to explain symbolically what this birth and early life held, what meaning was there that was only really known and experienced later. Okay, so my description of our session this time was, you know, the Christmas stories and the slash. Now I realize I haven't seen any. I think there are a whole series of slasher movies. Is that right? And are they, you know, monster horror movies? And I'm sorry about that, but I'm thinking grammatically that the slash, you know, it's like either or, the slash. So when we think about the birth narratives, is it history remembered? And I get these categories from Marcus, okay? Is it history remembered? Like, is this really how it happened? Or is it history the way Marcus talks about it, metaphorized? Is the language journalistic? Like, if you were there, you would have seen the three kings coming, or wait, it was really shepherds and Luke, but that you could have, that CNN could have captured this, okay? Or is the language of the narratives, is it more poetic? And I don't mean poetry, I don't mean rhyming. Poesis means to create, to make. Are these stories creations that are trying to create meaning in the richness of the imagery that's used? Are the very particulars about the story, is that what we should focus on? Or are the particulars symbolic of a bigger narrative that actually is carried throughout the whole of the New Testament, or the whole of, let's say, the Gospel of Matthew, or the whole of the Gospel of Luke? Are there themes that are introduced in the birth narratives that then unfold and carry out through the narrative of the Gospels? As you know, Marcus would say, this is not history, the birth narratives are not history remembered. It's more like history metaphorized. It's not journalism, it's more poetic. It's not, they are particular, the birth narrative is particular, but actually in the birth narrative are hints of the whole story that we will see played out in the Gospels, okay? So I find that very helpful as we think about what are the birth narratives. And they are Matthew and Luke are very different from each other. Matthew, for instance, has Jesus' genealogy, goes back to Abraham and Sarah, and his genealogy comes through David, and Matthew wants to establish that Jesus has a lineage of kingship. Okay. And Matthew talks about Herod seeing Jesus as a rival king, okay, and can't stand that, and therefore does everything he possibly can to get rid of the presence of Jesus, including killing all male babies under the age of 2. Well, whether that really happened or not is not as important as the idea that Herod was so upset with what Jesus would end up representing, which is a totally different way of being in empire, okay? A totally different way of living together. That Herod wanted to get rid of Jesus. That is told very early on in the narrative, and of course we know later that Jesus is executed. But as I said earlier, if we didn't know that Jesus was executed by by the authorities, we wouldn't be doing this retrospective of the birth narratives. Okay, so his life and death came first, and these birth narratives are subsequent. Matthew also has 3 kings coming to see Jesus. Okay, as it's like a witness of it takes a king to know a king kind of thing. There's this bright star in the night sky that, here we go, there's light in the darkness. These were dark times. There is a light in the darkness that leads us to another way of being. Okay. For those who might want to really fuss about, now, were they 3 kings, or were they 3 astrologers, or where exactly did they come from? I think that's a waste of time. Or for those who astronomically want to know, when was the time when there was this confluence of all of these stars that maybe made this light in the sky so bright that, of course, that's what led them. I personally think that's a fool's errand. It misses the point that these are stories that are trying to communicate meaning in symbolic and imaginary ways. Okay. And the way that Matthew constructs his birth narrative really speaks to his audience. He sees Jesus as almost like a new Moses, a new kind of king figure. So his whole gospel is designed around that. And Matthew has a very distinct way of doing this. Luke's lineage, for instance, goes back to Adam, all of humanity, rather than Abraham and Sarah. Luke traces Jesus' lineage through the prophets, through Nathan, considers Jesus among the tradition of the classical prophets. He emphasizes that more than he does kingship. In Luke, the first recognition of, or the first news of the birth of Jesus comes to the shepherds, not to kings. Shepherds were outcasts. They were a marginalized community. Luke speaks very powerfully to the marginalized. Okay. So Luke's narrative has the word of light and possibility coming to the outcasts, not to the kings. Okay. Luke has Mary doing a beautiful song. It's actually borrowed from Hannah in the Hebrew Bible, but Mary has a speaking role in Luke, not so in Matthew. There are real differences in the way that the story is told. What is similar is that in both of these stories, there is a light in the night sky. There is a light in the darkness. There is something that can be seen even in the midst of deep darkness. Okay. So what I want to just say here about the Matthew and Luke birth narratives is that they are both very different. When we see children's pageants, we tend to mush both of those stories together as though, you know, it's one story. But I think that as we look at the way that the narratives are constructed and why, and you know, Marcus's great question is, why is the story told this way? Why is the story told this way? What can we understand about what is trying to be communicated in the way that Jesus' birth is described? By the way, thinking about Matthew, you know, born in a manger. I think in Luke, he's in a cave, you know, the birth is in a cave. But think about being born in a place called Bethlehem, which means house of bread. By the way, Jesus was born in Nazareth, probably in about 4 BCE. But think of the idea of being born in a place called the house of bread and being born in a manger, which is a feeding trough. And then think much later about how Jesus is talked about as life and bread and nourishment for the world. Okay. So if you think about that imagery alone, I think it's brilliant in terms of what it is communicating and what it evokes in the hearers of those who are listening to these stories. So so when we think about the Christmas stories and the slash, history remembered, history metaphorized, it's more about metaphor than it is about precise history. Is it journalistic or is it more poetic in the use of language? Poetic. There are themes that are introduced in all of these stories, but they actually prefigure the whole of the story of Jesus. So these are just brilliant, brilliant stories. And I think that if we over-historicize them or try to literalize them in some way, we miss the importance of these stories. So let me now move to what is bothering me this year about the Christmas stories. And let me name it this way by identifying but another slash. We all know that the story of Jesus and Jesus' birth, that Jesus talks about the presence and the coming of the kingdom of God as very distinct from the kingdom of Caesar. Okay. And that the way that Caesar or Herod runs the kingdom, it's about domination, it's about marginalization, it's about fear, it's authoritarian, it's unjust. Okay. And Jesus comes along and says, there's a different way to be. And that if God were in charge, I know that the nature and character of God is something we continue to unpack and wonder about together. But if God were in charge, that the world would be very, very different. Okay. If we understood more about the nature and character of God and of our humanity and the importance of love and justice, we would treat each other very differently. So it's clear that Jesus and the notion of the kingdom of God and not the kingdom of Caesar, it's very clear that Jesus is a complete contrast to the strong man that is Herod, or the strong man that is Caesar, or the strong man that runs empire. Okay. So Jesus is just it's the opposite of a strong man. Just the opposite. What I'm fussing with this year is, do we see Jesus? And those of us who may still figure that God is an entity, here in our conversations that we are deconstructing the idea that God is an entity or a supernatural being. But if you have that in your imagination, is Jesus a kind of strong man? Or is God actually the strong man, the ultimate strong man? So this year, I'm really struggling with how we play with this. So another slash, is Jesus an idol or is Jesus an icon? Idols presume to be more than they are. Like they claim divinity. An idol will, it's like this is God, and it isn't. And an icon is more representative of something. Okay, but do we see Jesus as an idol? Do we idolize him, or is he more of an icon of something? Is Jesus a strong man? And God a strong man? Or, I say Jesus is not a strong man. He's just the opposite of that. And I think that there are two books that have been recently published that I think have affected my preoccupation with this. And one is a book titled, it's by Kristen Kobes-Dumez, D-U-M-E-Z. She's a history professor at Calvin University, actually. of all places. She has a book called Jesus and John Wayne. And the subtitle actually says it all. Her subtitle is How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. She talks about sort of a modern evangelical militarism and an American understanding of masculinity that pairs the Duke and the Messiah. Okay. I'm not going to be referring to her book this morning, but I think that it's a very provocative. I've heard her speak. I have not read all of her book, but it's very provocative that she sees in American evangelicalism today a symmetry between John Wayne and Jesus. Okay, it's disturbing. By the way, the West Star Institute, which is also known as the home of the Jesus Seminar people, they've done some work on this book. The other book that's been published recently that I'm aware of is by Ruth Ben-Ghiat, and she's also a professor of history. And she has a book called Strong Men, From Mussolini to the Present. Okay, she does not talk about Jesus or Herod, but she offers a description of strong men and what they are afraid of and what they require. And as I've reviewed some of those characteristics, it has struck me that the way that we talk about Jesus and even his second coming sounds much more like how we might describe a strong man. Last year, what caught me when we were talking at this time of year about the Christmas stories, I emphasized Advent. We're in the season of Advent, the coming of Jesus. But what I realized last year is that Advent is about the coming of the Messiah, the second coming, more than it is about the birth of Jesus. It's about the second coming. And so many of the hymns talk about Jesus as being King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and all nations shall be drawn to him, and he shall reign forever and ever. And this exaltation of what is to come, of the Messiah. Now, in Jesus' life, was that the kind of Messiah that he was? I don't think so. I mean, he was executed by the authorities. And so is there something about the tradition or beliefs about what we hoped he would be, that when he comes the next time, he'll fulfill that image of Messiah as strong man? Is that what we're hoping for? Okay. Now, let me just underscore, Jesus is not a strong man. He is not then, not now, never will be. But what has struck me this year is how often we talk about him as though he is. And I'm particularly concerned, and I get this from Ruth Ben-Ghiat's book. I'm particularly concerned about our vulnerability to think of Jesus as a strong man in this time, because she identifies a vulnerable time in history for the influence of authoritarians, when there are opposing ideological claims, when there's a polarization and division in a country, when there are fears and insecurities and moments of uncertainty and transition, that we are much more vulnerable to an authoritarian type figure who will play with our mindset of our longing for a utopia, our wistfulness about nostalgia, and the fact that we are living in a time of crisis. And that this is an atmosphere that is prime for an authoritarian or a strong man. As I said, her book sort of talks about the strong men from Mussolini to the present. Okay, but I was very struck by the image of the strong man. And being in the season of Advent, how much we talk about Jesus as though he's a strong man. I'm just going to go through a couple of descriptions from Ben-Ghiat's book about strong men, and just note a couple of things that popped out at me and have concerned me. She says that one of the things that strong men fear most, now this is strong men, is a sense of solidarity amongst the people, a sense of love, an openness to dialogue, an openness to the other, viewing the other with compassion, with a kind of optimism, that a strong man, which is an authoritarian, it fears that the authoritarian sort of lacks empathy, lacks qualities of being human. And I think about, how we need to be careful when we talk about Jesus as though he's not human, as though he's some divine figure, which is also what the authoritarian claims, is that the authoritarian is divinely anointed as a leader. Ben-Ghiat says this, a really interesting phrase about that authoritarians tend to lack love. I mean, there's an absence of love. And she describes it as a black cloak of indifference where they lose their eye for love and care, that they no longer see clearly because of their cloak of a dark cloak of indifference, because of the absence of love in their understanding. I find that really interesting. And of course, Jesus' whole message is about the importance of love, justice, compassion. Authoritarians, strong men will lie and do anything to engage in corruption, anything to protect their self-interest. I want to be really thoughtful about how we protect the self-interest of Christianity. The strong man has a boundless need for control and adoration, needs praise, devotion, and that it's important that the people believe in him, that they believe in him. We tend to talk that way even about Jesus, or think about how when we talk so much about, oh, God loves our praise. God needs our praise. I've heard that in my earlier days when I was hanging out more with evangelicals. I would hear this a lot. The importance of praising God. God loves praise. I never understood that. What is that about? Ruth Ben-Ghiat talks about strong men needing that kind of adoration and praise. I'm not saying we shouldn't say hallelujah, praise the Lord. I've said that many, many, many times in my life. I've raised my arms in exaltation. Okay, but I'm just sort of struck with the language of this, and it's just struck me in a way that's disturbed me this year. As you know, strong men, as I said earlier, feel that they have been anointed, that it's divine providence that has put them in a position. They feel that they're invulnerable and immortal, and they have a kind of divine protection. I mean, Hitler said that when he avoided a bombing attempt. He said, I'm invulnerable, I'm immortal. I just want to be thoughtful about when we talk about Jesus or even God. Do we use that kind of language? And I would say that it's not that the authoritarian borrows this from Jesus or from God. I wonder if we don't borrow it from them. I mean, this is where I'm wrestling this year. Let me see if there's a couple of another thing, and Dumez talks about this in her book, the cult of male force. the cult of male force. We've certainly seen that in the way we understand and talk about God. And if Jesus is the new victor, how do we understand hierarchy and male force and male domination and the victory of God and Jesus? How do we put all that together? Another thing that is significant, that is characteristic of strong men, is that there's enormous power held in one individual. Enormous power in one individual. And that if a nation is under duress and a kind of victimhood, that one individual can be the savior of the nation. Authoritarians tend to want to cleanse the world of things that are vague, weak, uncertain. They're skilled in the art of threat, and they capitalize on calamity. The reason I mention this is because there's so much talk these days about end times and about sort of an apocalyptic understanding of things. And I just wonder if that isn't also playing with and manipulating our fears of calamity. Something else that she says is that an authoritarian will tend to enslave us, and listen to this, in the name of liberty, glory, and power. How much of our understanding of Christianity, how many of us have been threatened by, if you don't affirm what we say is the truth about Jesus being our Lord and Savior, and if you don't accept him as the one who is going to free you from the wrath of God, if you will, or assure you of a better future life. We do all this in the name of liberty and glory and power. And we claim Jesus' salvation efforts in that kind of language. The other thing I'll mention about authoritarians is that they not only represent a nation's sorrows and dreams, both, but they embody them. Okay. And I think the way we talk about Jesus, all that language is mixed up in our devotion to Jesus. One more thing I want to say about this is that the authoritarian or the strong man does not have a plan for failure. There is no plan B. It's either his way or no way. Okay. And I worry about that with Christianity as well. That do we make it sound like it's either the Christian way or no way? So in talking to a good friend of mine this week, I said to my friend Yarmo Tarki, I said, I don't want to sound like a Debbie Downer today. We're in a time where it's sort of post-COVID, sort of. We just want to kind of get back to normal. We'd love to be able to gather together and celebrate, and for those of us who are Christian, talk about the light and the darkness and what Jesus' life and vision gives us, and the hope and possibility that's embodied in him, and that he assures, that's in us, and Jesus' way of understanding God as anything but a strong man, right? So this is a time when it's like, Marianne, lighten up. We just want to kind of get back to a kind of normalcy. And I'm all for that. But I decided today that what I was going to share with you was my angst this season. And as I said, I think it's been shaped somewhat by these two books, John Wayne and Jesus, and Strong Men. But I also see this in the way that we talk about our own faith experience in Christianity. And it concerns me. So what I would like to, I'm going to give us a little pause to refresh our minds in just a moment. I'm going to play a little section from Handel's Messiah. But for the plenary time, I mean, I'd love your thoughts about, what do you make of the Christmas stories yourself? What do you make of this time of year? What do you make of my anxiety about this strong men language and how we use that in Christianity? And what do we think is the light of the world? What is that light in the darkness? I mean, Marcus would say, I would too. I would say my full embodiment of the light in the world is Jesus. Okay. But what do we think is the light in the darkness? So I'd love to hear from you and get your responses, and maybe you can help me out with my angst. I'm going to ask Jake to play a selection from Handel's Messiah. It's about 3 minutes, so just relax. This angel hair that I put around Christmas, just get rid of it, quiet your minds, see what comes up for you in terms of what you'd like to share during the plenary. And this is the music that you will hear. It's preceded, by the way, by saying that the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. So the invitation of this music is, come unto him, come unto Jesus, come unto him. All ye that labor, come unto him. All ye that are heavy laden, and he will give you rest. Take his yoke upon you. Learn from him, for he is meek and lowly of heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Okay, so let's just listen to this music and calm ourselves, and then we'll move into plenary time. Jake, would you play that for us? that comes from the part of the Messiah where it talks about, and he will feed his flock like a shepherd. I always thought it was, he will lead his flock like a shepherd. And shepherds lead from behind. So for years, I just thought it meant he will lead his flock like a shepherd. The text is actually, he will feed his flock like a shepherd. Okay, I would love to hear your, I'd love to have you engage in what I've been fussing about, and I'd love to hear some of your thoughts. Whoops. Sorry.
Marianne, I thought we might, you mentioned laughter at the beginning, so I thought we might start with a little laughter. Celia had a comment
We could
about
use
about the little green person sitting above your shoulder. So Celia, do you want to come in and share your comment about that? Celia, are you there with us? She may have left.
Well, it's our beloved little Kermie. I didn't realize.
What she said was, is the little green person the good angel or the bad angel?
Well, I'm happy to report that it's a good angel. This is our little Kermit the Frog, who, as you know, and his rainbow, the vision of the rainbow connection, and that he knows what Jesus knows, that there are possibilities. There's something that calls us. He's lured by what we're lured by in Jesus. So yes, it's lovely that actually Kermit, I realize that he's with us today. I'm glad that he's there to just remind us that all this anxiety I have about the strong man, it's like Kermit is saying, it's all right.
Remember the rainbow connection.
Yeah, the rainbow connection. It's for lovers and dreamers and people like you and me.
Yeah. Thanks, Marianne.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff.
Then we had the other Marianne who had an interesting comment about St. Nicholas Day as it's celebrated in Europe. Marianne, are you there?
Yes. Yes, when we were children, I was brought up in Brussels. And when we were children, we never celebrated a commercial Christmas. It was always the Christian Christmas. So Christmas Eve, midnight mass. And then there was a special meal usually, le réveillon, the sort of Christmas Eve meal. And then you went to mass, and then there was no present. But there was St. Nicholas, Saint Nicolas. St. Nicholas Day on the 6th of December. He is the patron saint of children in the Catholic calendar. And he is celebrated in Belgium, in Holland, in Germany, and I think in some Nordic countries as well. And that's the day that we got a present, one present, not the craziness of commercialism today, where the kids are fed up opening their presents. They're bored opening presents. It's incredible. And the teachers then, it was a school day, so the teachers would buy a speculoos, which is a little spicy biscuit, not spicy, hot, but made with spices, speculoos. And the teachers would buy speculoos, and when you went to school, on your desk, we each had a little speculoos, and then we got a present, and that was one present from our parents, not the craziness of today. And so that was the toy sort of giving day, but Christmas was the Christian story. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. So much simpler and clearer and lighter and affirming.
Yeah. But I mean, I live in England, so when I became British because of Brexit, but you have to, I mean, I'm too old, so I don't have to take the test, but I thought I was going to have to. And some of the questions, you got these books to prepare to make sure that you are, British enough. And ridiculous. And one of the questions was, is Christmas a religious or a commercial festivity? Well, I thought religious. Oh, that was wrong.
That's great. I mean, that's
and that was from the government. It's incredible.
So that's a great
Thank you.
question. No, Marianne, I love that. It's like, okay, so maybe that's a question for us. Is it a religious holiday or is it a commercial holiday? So
Depends who you're talking to, I suppose. But
yeah, I think it depends who, yes, indeed. And when I think of it as a commercial holiday, I can lighten up. When I think of it as a religious holiday, I get all mixed up.
crazy, crazy. Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you so much. Thank you, Marianne. Nice to have you with us.
Thank you. You too.
Yeah, lovely.
And Jim High has had his hand up for a while. So Jim, do you want to share your question or your comment?
Yes, hello, Marianne.
Hello, Jim. Hi, how are you?
The
You're
other day I
becoming
had
a regular feature. You're a regular feature of Second Saturday.
the other day I had an interesting thought. I wanted to know the history of Christmas. So I go to the internet and put in history of Christmas, and
Uh-huh.
I find this wonderful long article about the history of Christmas. And it changes from from decade to decade. It's just we celebrated nothing like they used to.
Yeah.
And so then I began to think, how should we celebrate it in the future? What can we change? And I've come up with what I think is a good idea. And I'm just going to lay it on the table for everybody to think about it.
Excellent.
Christmas is the 25th of December, which we all celebrate. And New Year's is the first of the year, January the 1st.
Okay.
And they're 1 week apart, always. And so I'm going to morph them together and call it the Happy Holidays in this season of beginnings and endings. And we can celebrate the beginning of the Christian story, the beginning of the new year. We can celebrate the ending of some of the traditions of the Christian story that need to end, and some of the endings of the things in our lives that we need to end, and the beginnings we want to make. And we get away from Merry Christmas and go to Happy Holidays, but it's in this season of beginnings and endings.
Okay.
And that's just, I think down the future, that's what we'll do.
Good. And it underscores that all things change, right?
Yes.
All things change, endings and beginnings.
If you
And-
keep doing the same thing,
Yeah. And
doing the same thing over and over and over, you never change.
right, right. And so much talk about, the end of the world. I think what's hinted at in some of the gospel stories is the end of world as we have known it. The end of world, not the world, but the end of course, we might be looking at the end of the world, true, but the end of world as we have known it. So what you're suggesting also encompasses that endings and beginnings, the end of what we've known, the opening to what is yet to come.
Except I'm going to always remember to call it beginnings and endings.
Beginnings and endings, nice.
This Christmas is the beginnings part,
Okay,
and the endings is the New Year's part.
interesting.
But there are also so many things in our lives that are beginnings and endings that could go for that.
Right.
And that would be a whole season. Maybe the business community would decide to let us have the whole week off. Go shopping.
Thank you, Jim. Good
Yeah.
for us to think of it, to reframe
Yeah.
this, reimagine it. Thank you, Jim. Take good care of yourself always.
And thanks, Jim. I wanted to, the person whose name on their screen is Pathways Church so I don't know who they are, but they had a comment about how they deal with these issues by celebrating winter solstice. And I thought that might be a good piggyback to what Jim was talking about. Is the person who is Pathways Church with us?
That's this is Stephen Braun. I've been on a few times. Can you
Oh,
hear
hi.
me?
Yes, hello, Stephen. Nice to see you.
Okay, I didn't realize that it said that because I can't see that tiny print. But yes, at the UU church I go to, we've been talking about winter solstice. We have a group called Mystic Path that meets on the last Thursday or the second Thursday of every month, and we did winter solstice. Well, that led into how all these different faith traditions celebrate something that seemed to me to be pretty close to winter solstice. Whether it's Hanukkah, Diwali, Festival of Lights, India, a lot of Asian countries have different things. Now, so we played with that, and I'm also doing a book study on fairy tales of all things. And in that, we talked about the difference between mythology, legend, and fairy tales. So they're all about common people, which is sort of a thread in the gospel stories, as opposed to legends, which are people like Robin Hood, where you've taken a historical person but mythologize them. And so anyway, trying to universalize the season, trying to demythologize it a bit and make it something that we see the web of how people all over the world and all the cultures and all through history have celebrated around this time of the year for some reason or another, their special times. So
Nice.
thanks for the moment.
Yeah, nice, very interesting. Thank you, Stephen.
Mm.
And I like what you're suggesting about finding the sort of the universal, the images or what this time of year evokes and all of this kind of stuff. So that's great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Cheryl McGinnis has her hand up. Cheryl?
Hi there. Several years ago, I got bored during the Christmas season. I taught middle school and health. And the unit we were on was anger management and conflict resolution. And I got totally bored. So what I did is I divided the groups up into small groups that I knew they would not work together. And we went over all of the stuff on how to work together. And I had them take Christmas songs and rewrite the lyrics according to that section of the book they were to represent, and they had to sing it. And it really was, it was hysterical. We actually performed some at the Christmas concert, and it was so much fun. I had one really astute student, and she comes up and she says, it's really hard to write this conflict resolution in anger management to a Christmas carol, which is so light and frothy. And here we're talking about these things in war. And I thought about it and went back to her and I said, well, look at the Christmas story. It's in an occupied territory. They've had to move. If you add the flight to Egypt part of it, they were after him and the whole thing. And then it all came together because in our church, in this one seat, you look at a picture at the cry room and has this beautiful picture of Mary and the child, and they're kind of looking back over their shoulder, and on the wall is reflected through the glass is a huge cross that is a window, and here they are looking over their shoulder at what's ahead. So that quote that you had from Marcus in that book about the first Christmas, absolutely gelled. And so it was just amazing. It was an astounding experience, and your whole presentation today encaptured that, that feeling that I've had. So thank you very much.
Oh my goodness. Well, I think in some ways I'm dealing with my own anger management and conflict resolution, what I've been fussing with today. So I appreciate that you're kind of putting it in a lighter vein that, So anyway, thank you for that too. And yes, The First Christmas is an important and really interesting book. So and Marcus has a clarity about him with these things that that's definitely worth looking at. So thank you, Cheryl, so much.
Thanks, Cheryl. Joan Pazer had a comment about appreciating your angst because it makes her feel less alone. I wonder, Joan.
Goodness. Well, great. Speak up, Joan, because you'll make me feel less alone. Are you there?
Joan?
Yes. Yes, it definitely comes up every year. So I just appreciate, I think I have healed a lot of the grief. I like that you said there was this unresolved grief for years. And I do think I have resolved that and have made friends with this time of the year, that it doesn't, bring all those things up. So I'm thinking there's some healing that's happened. But I so appreciate this conversation of, the birth stories and just everything that you have suggested. it helps me to let go of, it's like, do I even want to go to church I don't think so. I don't want to hear all those stories and the flowery, it doesn't connect anymore. So part of me is sad about that.
Mhm.
But the things that have been expressed here, both in the chat and what you have shared, Marianne, the love, the compassion, the kindness all comes through.
Right.
And so that's where, all the things that people are kinder. I mean, I think we've been kinder over these last couple of years than we've been in a long time, but more aware of being kind and speaking gently. So if nothing else, that is what also happens in the midst of the angst.
Wow.
So it's a both end, and just, appreciate your words to open up the heart a little more. So thank you. In the midst of your angst, it's a good thing, angst.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that, Joan, because this, it felt a little vulnerable for me to sort of
I'm sure it did.
out through
but
this today. So anyway, thank you for that.
Mm.
I appreciate it.
Sort of building on that, what Joan was saying about compassion and love. Jacob Egley was wondering about how we define strength. Jacob, are you there?
Merry Christmas, everyone.
Jake, it's really, I know Jake. Jake lives in Bend. So this is lovely. Hi, Jake.
Hi.
Sweet.
No, my question just had to do with, we're kind of vilifying strength, okay? Like, I mean, is this just a matter of looking at strength in sort of a non-dominant way? The past 6 weeks, I've spent a lot of time with hospice workers who I would say are the strongest people I have ever been around. And it has nothing to do with the sort of power that something like Christian nationalism embraces. So I just wonder about tweaking our definition of strength.
I love what you're saying, and also of power, because I'm not against power, but the way we talk about power, just what you're saying, Jake, about dominance and coercion and all of that. I don't think I think we can do better than that. That's why I'm attracted to this understanding of weak theology, even though that word weak makes us, do what Maynard G. Remember Maynard G. Krebs on the Dobie Gillis show? Every time he heard the word work, he went, what? So every time we hear weak, we think, but it's in line with what you are inviting us to reconsider and reimagine, to reimagine strength, to reimagine power, to maybe reimagine quote unquote weakness. Okay. So I love what you're saying. And I think that's part of the task of how we talk about being Christian in the 21st century.
Well, just the fact that the message of love, compassion, justice, equality, and service continues to resonate with so many people seems like that is the indication of the strength.
Well said.
Mm.
And I don't think we hear enough of that, because
Yeah.
that loud voice of dominance tends to drown out what you hear, what I hear, what Kermit hears. What I think we all hear actually here on Second Saturdays. Do you hear what I hear? I hear what you're saying.
Do you hear what I
And
hear?
thank you, Jake. I mean, carry that on, carry on this conversation.
Mm.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's really important.
Thanks, Jake. I just want to add my 2 cents here, because yesterday, Carol and I were listening to a podcast with Rebecca Solnit, and she was speaking exactly of that, and how our culture, and particularly the press, because she's a journalist, amplifies the dominant strength to the detriment of the kind of strength that Jake is talking about. And the window she was looking at to talk about this was Hurricane Katrina. And she gave example after example after example of the amazing love and compassion and cooperation and community that arose in that quote unquote disaster that never got reported. And what was reported was all of the horrors of the dominance and the corruption. And she said, you know, it's an amazing sign of strength and it's still with us, but we never hear about it.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah, very interesting. And I think too, a lot of news cycle stuff tends to talk about these, tends to give voice to the strong man.
Right. Right.
And if Jesus' life and death means anything, it is, it completely delegitimizes the strong man.
Yeah. Yeah.
And affirms that the real power of new life in going about this a very, very different way.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know? And for us to find the language for that too, to affirm that, you know, because I think that this, you know, what has been bothering me this year, it's almost like, you know, we've got Herod on the throne, but out with Herod, we'll put Jesus on the throne instead.
Yeah. Right.
You know, well, it's the kingdom of Caesar. Well, now it's the kingdom of God, but same thing, just we got our guy in there.
We put our guy on this throne. Yeah.
That's not what this is about at all. You know, so for us to take real responsibility for what is the story? What are we saying? What are the images that we're trying to talk about? You know, what are the images trying to talk about? So anyway, thank
Yeah.
you.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Mary. Cindy R has her hand raised. Cindy.
Hi, thanks for the welcoming space and thanks for your vulnerability, everyone. I think Cindy Radke, I just forgot to type my last name. Anyway, I think I appreciate the struggles. And I think what for me, I've been working on this season is we're all human. And so human for us to try to fit everything into some kind of box and make it easy. And so for here, you know, I haven't been studying Matthew and Luke as much as I've been working with John, and then beginning with Nicodemus, in the sense that metaphorically, he's so literal. He's wrestling in the dark. He's not working in the light. So for me, you're naming one thing I think that is something to meditate on, and I appreciate it in the sense of what's getting in the way of really seeing Jesus. What does it mean for me, in that story also, we learned in the Greek that lifted up and exalt, when he refers to Moses himself as the servant or the serpent staff that Moses was directed to make. Jesus is about healing our hearts, to exalt him as the window to God to heal. And what are we as humans in our definition putting in the way?
Right.
I would invite a different thing of strength, because that song actually talked about Jesus being strong because we could give him all our burdens. So if there is a
Oh,
different,
interesting. Nice catch.
you know, I don't know if strength is all my way or the highway, or if it's, which that is a definition of strength that you named, and I do affirm that. Or is it stronger with that compassion, that healing? And so I think you've given us so much to think about, and where are our traditions, where the other person was talking, I don't know everybody's names yet, sorry, but how do we get rid of what we have put, and where do we focus, and where do we see Jesus? And the other thing I think is so human is to idolize not only Jesus, but everybody.
Right.
If they're in history, all of a sudden they're mythological. And this is what I do when I teach, is I take away that myth. Okay, but we're all light and dark. And some of our most famous peace healers have some interesting darknesses, but does that make them that they didn't change the world? And so in our humanness, we all want to just say, oh, we're perfect. So if they're perfect, we can't do anything because we're not perfect. So we're going to give ourselves a pass. So we're all like about this, you know, how do we get out of really wrestling with this? And so I appreciate your thoughts. But for me, it's for Jesus to, you know, yeah, we got to be careful with that language of king, and then, but what are we really looking to him for? And
Good.
is strong, but can we take that back a step and redefine it? And
Right.
yeah, but you know, it's about our humanness and continually getting out of our own way at Advent, so we can have a new beginning.
Yeah, nice, nice. Oh, Cindy, I really love how you've pulled all this together, and you've acknowledged what Jake is saying too, which is we've got to redefine some of these things. You know, I love the Nicodemus. I love your description of Nicodemus, and you know, and this how can this be? Which is, of course, what Mary has supposedly, you know, said. How can this be? So there is something about these stories too that affirms a structure of impossibility that's deep in us and maybe deep in reality, that we might call it impossible, but maybe it's really possible, you know. But how can this be, you know? And so just like, how can Jesus be this? He's not a strong man. It's something else. Yeah. So, but I love what you're saying, for us to reimagine, you know, it's like dare to think differently, dare to dream, dare to act differently, you know, think this differently. And I think these stories compel us to do that, if they're worth anything at all. So anyway, Cindy, thank you. I'm glad you teach. Thank you for helping us today.
Marianne, do we have time for one more person?
Sure. I have
Sarah McDonald has had her hand up for a while. And so
good, Sarah.
Hi, sorry I was late and then I had some computer problems. I'm a member of the Poor People's Campaign, the National Call for Moral Revival. And I'm
fantastic.
And you know what today is? It's the International Day of Human Rights. So I figure this is a perfect time to talk about Jesus.
Right.
Jesus is that model of human rights and dignity. And as you know, it's hard for those of us who are impacted. I mean, I voluntarily decided that I would spend down my assets to get health care about 4 years ago. So I'm a Medi-Cal recipient, SNAP, and then I have an Obama phone. And then I'm here in the Democratic Club's office where I can use the internet. So, you know, if you can, I think this time of the year is very hard for those of us who can't give money, can't do the things, but we can give of ourselves just like Christ gave of himself. We may not die on the cross, but we can be out there helping grow our family, which is the whole world. Our whole world is family. And as one of the things in the Poor People's Campaign, we do call and response, and it's forward together, not one step back. But there's another one. When we lift from the bottom, everybody rises. And that's what Jesus is calling us to do in Matthew 25 clearly. And Matthew 25 models what I think is the Declaration of Human Rights. Thank you.
Yes, yes. When was I in prison? When was I thirsting? When was I hungry? Right? That's Matthew 25. And when you do it to these, yeah. I love that you're part of the Poor People's Campaign. William Barber is, I think, one of the most important Christian voices in America today.
He really is. And I went to Washington, D.C. last year for the June 18th march, and then in LA. So it's an exciting time, but we've got to really, you know, I hate to get a little bit political, but Jesus was political too. We all have to help one another to get out of this morass that's plaguing our country and our world.
I agree.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. And in one of the quotes that I showed in the beginning, Marcus himself says, you know, yes, these stories hit us deeply and personally, but the story of Jesus is also political. Because it has to do with the polis, the people, the community. It has to do with how we live with one another. So the Christian message, it is political. And that gives us a lot to think about as well. You know, and Marcus would say, if we miss the political importance of the story, then we actually miss its meaning. So anyway, thank you for that. Thank you for all of you for your comments. I could just sit here and listen to more of you. It would help.
And there are a lot more. I'll just
Good. Well, I will look forward to the chat myself later on. That sounds great. For those who can stay for coffee time, we'll have some coffee sometime after this. But let me close with one announcement. Next session, January 14th, second Saturday of January 2023. Can you believe that? We'll have a special guest. It's Barbara Brown Taylor. And Barbara Brown Taylor is just a wonderful human being. She's a wonderful human being. And she's a brilliant author. And, you know, it wasn't so long ago that she was called by Time Magazine one of the 10 best preachers in America. And anyway, she's great. And I was incredibly honored that she gave the homily at Mark's memorial service. We gave a memorial service for Marcus in March of 2015. He died in January of 2015. And Barbara gave the homily. So, and that homily, by the way, is reprinted in a collection of Marcus's work called Days of Awe and Wonder. But I am incredibly grateful to Barbara for many, many things, the homily at his memorial, and for her upcoming presence with us in January. So I look forward to talking with Barbara about what does she make of everything that's going on. So tell your friends, you know, Barbara, just like Brian McLaren, not to be missed. Let me tell you what the closing music is for today. It's also from the Messiah, and it's from Isaiah 9, and it's the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. They that dwell in the land of the shadow of death, upon them light has shined. Okay. So as we continue to move in this season, we might ask, what great light do we see? What light do we see? And as you know, I say that the light is certainly seen in Jesus. And, you know, Jesus' story is it's a love story of compassion for all of humanity that resists the state or the empire's attempt to deny it or destroy it. And it is a political story. Even as it is a love story. I want to close this time with a quote from a woman whose name is Natalie Ginsburg. She wrote this in 1944. So this is close to the end of World War II. She's an Italian writer. And I'm going to read this twice. And I think that this is for us to think about as well. She asks, how to free ourselves of all the darkness and the veils behind which we have hidden for so many years. How to find ourselves again. This might be Nicodemus's question. How to free ourselves of all the darkness and the veils behind which we have hidden for so many years. How do we find ourselves again? And I think the Christmas stories grapple with that very angst. And the tellers of that story say that they have seen a great light. And may it shine upon us as well. Thank you for being with us. I look forward to seeing you in January with Barbara Brown Taylor.